The calm before the storm. It was one of those rare, sun-drenched afternoons that seemed to last forever in a sleepy suburban town like Parkwood. The kind of day where time stretched lazily, and everything felt like it was in perfect balance. The neighborhood playground was bustling with the usual weekend crowd, children laughing and darting between swings, parents chatting casually on benches, enjoying the sight of their little ones running carefree in the warm sunlight. The air smelled faintly of freshly mowed grass, mingling with the distant aromas of family barbecues and the occasional whiff of popcorn. It was the perfect scene of suburban tranquility. And yet, amidst the cheer and innocent play, there was something, or rather, someone, out of place. Near the sandbox stood a tall man, his stature commanding and imposing, though his demeanor was not. He stood with a slight stiffness in his posture, his shoulders tense, his eyes constantly shifting, scanning his surroundings. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough for anyone paying attention to notice that this man was not at ease. His eyes darted from one end of the park to the other, flicking between the children, the parents, the distant swings, and the food trucks parked along the edge. There was a deep, palpable unease in the way he held himself, as though he were constantly on guard, hyper-aware of every movement around him. His dark brown eyes were sharp, assessing, even calculating, as if he were mentally mapping out the entire park in case something, anything, went wrong. Standing by his side, gripping his hand tightly with his tiny fingers, was a young boy. No more than 5, with soft golden curls that shone like a halo in the sunlight. His skin was pale, almost translucent in contrast to the darker hues surrounding him. The boy was still, too still for his age. He didn't run around with the other children, didn't join in their laughter or games. Instead, he stood quietly by the man's side, his eyes large and uncertain, following his every movement with a sense of trust, yet also a kind of wariness that seemed too advanced for a child his age. His tiny hand never loosened its grip on the man's, as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded in the sea of strangers. The pair, to the casual observer, might have looked like a father and son simply enjoying a quiet moment in the park. But there was something in their stillness, in the way they stood apart from the other families, that drew attention. The boy didn't run after the other children, didn't chase after the swings or the ball rolling across the grass. Instead, he stayed close to the man, his eyes occasionally scanning the park as though he were waiting for something. Or perhaps, as though he were preparing for something. A woman on a nearby bench, who had been mindlessly scrolling through her phone while cradling her small, yapping dog in her lap, couldn't help but notice them. Let's call her Karen. She wasn't one to judge immediately, but something about the man's presence, the way he held the boy's hand so firmly, set off an uncomfortable alarm in the back of her mind. She glanced up from her phone screen, her gaze drifting to the pair. The man's face was stern, his features sharp and unreadable. He wasn't smiling. His gaze was distant, constantly shifting, never resting on any one thing for too long. There was a tension in the way he stood, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as if he were preparing for something that might be coming at any moment. He was hyper-aware, alert, like a soldier standing watch. Karen tried to shake the feeling, telling herself she was simply overthinking things. She was a mother herself, after all, and she had seen plenty of fathers and their children at the park. But something about this didn't sit right. The man wasn't interacting with the other parents, and the boy didn't seem to want to play with the other kids. They were an island unto themselves, an anomaly in the sea of joyous chaos that surrounded them. The unease began to gnaw at Karen's thoughts. The way the man was holding the boy's hand, so tightly, so possessively, wasn't like how other fathers interacted with their children. It wasn't the normal casual grip that a parent might have on their child's hand, but something that felt almost desperate, as though he were afraid the child might slip away or run off. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched the pair. She told herself to relax, that there was no reason to jump to conclusions. But the nagging feeling in her gut only grew. She shifted uncomfortably on the bench, her little dog yapping at something invisible, oblivious to the storm that was quietly brewing in Karen's mind. Karen's fingers tightened around her phone as she debated with herself. Then, it happened. The boy, as though struck by some sudden wave of childish excitement, tugged at the man's hand. His bright eyes seemed to catch the glint of sunlight reflecting off the swings in the distance, and for the first time since they had arrived, a flicker of joy appeared on his face. His lips parted slightly in what might have been the beginning of a smile, and he reached toward the swings, the only real sign of a child's natural curiosity. But instead of encouraging him, the man, David, jerked his hand back, his entire body tensing. He looked down at the boy, his gaze hardening, before he leaned down to whisper something in his ear. Karen couldn't hear what he said, but the way the boy's expression faltered immediately was enough. The child's excitement was replaced with something else, something hard to define, but it looked like fear. David's eyes flicked up to meet Karen's. He didn't know why he was so attuned to her presence, but he could feel her eyes on him, like a weight on his shoulders. He knew the moment she had started watching them. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. The looks, the whispers, the suspicion, it was a constant in his life. A part of him had come to expect it, had even grown used to it. But when it came to Elijah, he couldn't let his guard down. Not for a second. And then, as if on instinct, he saw her fingers move toward her phone. Her eyes were flicking back and forth between him and the child. It was like a signal. David knew what was coming next. His heartbeat quickened, a familiar anxiety creeping up on him. He wasn't sure if it was the tone of her expression, the way she had looked at them both, or the way her fingers hovered above her phone screen. But something in her posture, tense, alert, told him that she wasn't just watching anymore. She was thinking. Thinking of what, exactly, David couldn't quite place. But it didn't matter. A flash of red and blue lights appeared in his peripheral vision. The unmistakable whine of sirens soon followed, breaking the calm atmosphere of the park. David froze. His hand instinctively tightened around Elijah's, his eyes scanning the park for an exit, for a way out. He needed to get Elijah to safety. But it was too late. The sirens were louder now, growing closer. He knew what would happen next. He had seen it before, felt it before. But this time, there was something else. This time, Elijah was with him. And nothing would be the same if he didn't keep calm. The story he had lived through countless times was about to unfold again. Only this time, it might cost him everything. A dangerous misunderstanding. The park, once filled with the sound of children's laughter, now seemed to hold its breath. The sirens, sharp and piercing, sliced through the atmosphere, setting off an alarm in David's chest. His heart rate quickened, and his pulse surged in his ears. For a moment, the world around him felt distant, as though he were suspended in time. All he could focus on was the growing sound of the sirens, closing in with a relentless intensity. Elijah's hand tightened around his, and David instinctively looked down at the boy. Elijah, wide-eyed and scared, seemed to sense the sudden shift in the air. His little fingers trembled, his grip almost too tight, as if he was trying to hold on to something that would keep him safe from what was unfolding around them. The boy had no idea what was happening, only that something was wrong, something was terribly, terribly wrong. "Daddy, what's happening?" Elijah whispered, his voice soft and trembling. David crouched down to his level, forcing a calm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's okay, Elijah. Just stay close to me, all right," he said, his voice steady but laced with an undertone of urgency. He gently ran a hand through the boy's curls, trying to reassure him, but deep inside, David knew the truth, this was anything but okay. The police cars screeched to a halt near the playground, and two officers leaped out with practiced speed, hands already hovering near their guns. The crisp sound of their shoes hitting the pavement echoed in David's ears, and his breath caught in his throat. The officers were focused on him, their expressions tense, their movements deliberate and controlled. They hadn't even looked at the other families, the other children, the other parents enjoying the day. Their eyes were locked on David, and everything about their body language screamed one thing: he was the threat. "Sir," one of the officers barked, his voice commanding, sharp. "Step away from the child and keep your hands where we can see them." David's body stiffened, every muscle locking into place. He could feel the heat of the officer's gaze as they approached him, their eyes scanning him for any sign of aggression, any movement that might suggest he was a danger. He knew better than to make any sudden moves. "Sir, I said step away from the child," the second officer repeated, his voice colder now. David opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to explain, to tell them that everything was fine, that this was his son, his flesh and blood, that there was no threat here, but he knew better than to speak too quickly. He had lived through enough situations like this to understand how easily a misunderstanding could escalate. Instead, he slowly released his grip on Elijah's hand, letting the boy take a small step back behind him. His eyes never left the officers as they circled him like predators, their hands still poised over their holsters, ready for any sign of aggression. Elijah, clearly frightened by the scene unfolding around him, tugged at David's sleeve. "Daddy?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper, but laced with fear. "What's happening? Why are they so mad at you?" David's stomach churned at the sound of Elijah's question. He didn't have an answer. How could he explain to his son that this was the reality of their lives? That no matter how hard he tried to protect him, no matter how much love he poured into their relationship, there would always be people like Karen, people who would look at them and see nothing but fear. That there would always be a moment like this, where everything he had worked so hard to build, his life, his family, his relationship with Elijah, was at risk of being torn apart by a simple misunderstanding. "I'm not mad at you, Elijah," David said quietly, his voice soft but firm. He didn't want the boy to think he was the cause of this. "Everything's going to be fine. Just stay behind me." But even as he said those words, David knew how fragile the situation had become. There were two officers now standing in front of him, their eyes narrowed, their postures rigid. The tension in the air was so thick that it seemed like it might snap at any moment. David's heart raced, but he forced himself to breathe steadily, to remain calm. He had to. For Elijah. The officers hadn't moved closer yet, but David could sense the hostility in their gazes, the suspicion in their every movement. They were waiting for something, anything, that would justify their actions. They weren't looking at him like a concerned parent. No, to them, he was a potential criminal, a threat. They had already made up their minds, and it didn't matter what he said or did. One of the officers stepped forward, his hand still hovering near his sidearm. His gaze flicked briefly to the boy behind David, then returned to David's face. "We received a call," the officer said, his tone clipped and professional. "A concerned citizen reported a potential kidnapping. You've been flagged as the suspect." The words hit David like a physical blow. A kidnapping? His mind raced as he tried to process the implications of what the officer was saying. But before he could respond, the other officer chimed in, his voice laced with suspicion. "The call came in saying you were acting suspicious, holding the boy's hand too tightly, not interacting with the other parents, and keeping the child close without allowing him to play freely. That's why we're here." David's stomach sank as the words settled in. He could feel the weight of the officer's accusation pressing down on him. The world around him seemed to close in. In that moment, nothing else mattered except the crushing realization that Karen had made the call. That she had seen him, seen Elijah, and without even knowing them, had judged them. And now, because of her paranoia, David's entire world was on the verge of unraveling. "Listen," David began, his voice strained but steady. "This is my son. Elijah is my son. We're not here to cause trouble. I'm just. You need to step away from the child, sir, the officer interrupted, his voice hardening. We'll take it from here. David's heart pounded in his chest as the officer's words hung in the air. His body tensed, every instinct screaming at him to protect Elijah, to keep the boy safe from this nightmare. He wanted to shout, to explain, to make them understand, but he knew it wouldn't help. This wasn't about reason or facts. This was about perception. And to the officers, he was already guilty. But Elijah, his sweet, innocent Elijah, didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to see his father treated like a criminal, didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of someone else's fear and ignorance. Please, David said, his voice breaking for the first time. Please, just listen to me. He's my son. He's not in danger. I'm not a threat. But the officers were already taking steps toward him. David's hand instinctively reached out, pulling Elijah closer, shielding him from what was coming. The sirens continued to wail in the distance, the harsh red lights flashing in the corner of his vision, but all David could think about was keeping Elijah safe, keeping him away from the nightmare that was about to unfold. And as the officers moved closer, one of them raised his radio to his mouth, ready to escalate the situation further. David's mind raced, and the world around him seemed to blur. But all he could hear were the terrified words of his son, "Daddy, please don't let them take me." The tipping point. The air around David seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow, but his mind was strangely focused. He knew this moment, this fragile, terrifying moment, could determine everything. One wrong move, one misstep, and the officers might escalate things beyond control. The fear in Elijah's eyes, the confusion on his face, the tremble in his tiny hand, David could feel it all deep in his soul. And yet, in the middle of all the chaos, he couldn't let himself break. He had promised himself, promised Elijah, that he would protect him no matter what. But protecting him now felt like an impossible task. David's eyes flicked between the two officers. They were closing in on him, each step purposeful and unwavering. His palms were slick with sweat, and his fingers curled around Elijah's hand with a force that almost hurt. The boy, still clinging to him, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Don't worry, Elijah," David whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising tension. "Everything will be okay. Just stay close." But the words felt hollow in his own ears. He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure the boy or himself. His whole body felt like it was in fight-or-flight mode. The officers' movements were so deliberate, so precise. One of them, the taller of the two, kept his hand near his holster, a silent threat. The other officer, the younger one, glanced between David and Elijah, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Sir, step away from the child," the officer repeated, his voice cold and unyielding. David opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to explain, to beg them to understand that he wasn't a threat. He wasn't the danger they thought he was. But the more he tried to calm himself, the more frantic the situation felt. "Please, just listen," David implored, his voice rising slightly, but not enough to sound confrontational. "This is my son. His name is Elijah. He's with me because I'm his father. We're just here to enjoy the park." But it didn't seem to matter. The officers were so focused on him, their minds already made up. The accusation in their eyes was clear: a black man, holding a white child too tightly, acting suspiciously in a place where he didn't belong. "Is that so?" the younger officer asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You expect us to believe that? A man, alone with a young child, who doesn't even want to play with the other kids? Doesn't seem right." David flinched at the officer's words. The accusation was all too familiar. It was a story he had heard in 100 different variations, a story he had lived through countless times. It didn't matter how many times he showed up at the park, how many times he tried to blend in and be just another parent with his child. To them, he was always a threat, always someone who didn't belong. The officer's eyes flicked briefly to Elijah, who was still standing behind David, looking up at the officers with a mixture of confusion and fear. The boy's lips trembled, his tiny hands clutching the back of David's shirt for support. His small voice, barely above a whisper, broke through the tense silence. "Daddy. I'm scared. Please, can we go home?" David's heart shattered at the sound of his son's voice. Elijah was so innocent, so trusting. He had no idea why these people, these strangers, were pointing at them, treating them like criminals. David bent down, trying to meet Elijah's gaze with as much warmth as he could muster. "I know, baby. I know." David's voice was low, trying to calm the boy, trying to offer him a sense of safety in the chaos. "I promise we're going to be okay. Just stay right here with me." But the officers weren't done. The older officer, the one who had first spoken, stepped closer, his eyes locking onto David's with a cold, unblinking stare. "You need to come with us, sir," the officer said, his voice now sharp and commanding. "You're not leaving here until we sort this out." David's stomach twisted at the officer's words. He knew what that meant. Being taken to the station, being questioned, his entire life laid bare for them to inspect, for them to judge, to dissect. For a brief moment, David froze, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating him. Every part of him screamed to run, to grab Elijah and get out of there before this spiraled further. But he knew he couldn't. He couldn't risk it. Not with Elijah right there, not with the officers already so tense. One wrong move, and everything could go wrong. His fingers tightened around Elijah's hand, and he took a slow, deep breath. He was trapped. There was no way out of this without escalating things. He had to think, and he had to think fast. "Sir, we're going to ask you to come with us now," the officer insisted, his voice harder now. "You can explain it all down at the station. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." David's mind raced. He knew what was coming next, the police station, the questions, the inevitable scrutiny of every detail of his life. But there was no way he was going to let Elijah go through that. He wasn't going to let them tear his family apart. Not again. He looked down at Elijah, who was still holding his hand tightly, but his small face was filled with fear, his wide eyes darting between the officers and David. "Daddy, I don't want to go with them," Elijah said, his voice small, his eyes brimming with tears. The pain in David's chest felt like it was ripping him apart. How could he explain to Elijah that this was the reality of their world? That no matter how much he loved him, no matter how hard he tried to protect him, there would always be people who looked at them with suspicion, who saw them as something dangerous because of the color of his skin? "Shoo, it's okay," David whispered, his voice shaking as he pulled Elijah closer. He knew the time for words was over. The officers were not listening anymore. They had already made up their minds. "Please," David said, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and frustration. "Please, just let us go. We're not a threat. We're just here to enjoy the park." But the officers were unmoved. The younger officer stepped forward, his hand now fully on his gun, ready to escalate further if needed. "Sir, step away from the child." The threat in the officer's voice was clear. It was a line that David could not cross. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and there was nothing he could do to reverse it now. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. David stood there, his body tense, his heart racing. And then, as if the universe had decided that the tipping point had been reached, something unexpected happened. A voice broke through the chaos. "Excuse me." All heads turned to the source of the voice, a woman, standing at the edge of the playground, her eyes wide with concern. Karen. The one who had made the call. The one who had caused all of this. She stepped forward, hesitating for just a moment before she spoke again. I'm sorry, Karen stammered. I made a mistake. I thought something was wrong, but now I see. I was wrong. David's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe the very person who had set this entire nightmare into motion was now standing before them, her face filled with guilt and regret. The weight of regret. The air seemed to freeze in that moment, as though the universe itself had come to a standstill. David stood there, his breath shallow, his grip on Elijah's hand so tight it almost hurt. The officers, still tense and ready for any sign of resistance, looked from Karen to David, their eyes flickering between the two as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Karen, the woman who had made the call, now stood before them, her posture stiff with a mixture of embarrassment and something deeper, regret, maybe, or the weight of a decision that had already spun out of control. Her small dog yapped nervously in her arms, but it went unnoticed by the people in the scene. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. The very person who had called the police on them, the one whose assumptions had nearly torn his life apart, was now admitting that she had been wrong. Karen began, her voice unsteady. I thought something was off, I thought he was. She cut herself off, her face flushing as she realized the gravity of her actions. But now I see. I was mistaken. I should never have called the police. David's mind raced. He wasn't sure what to feel, relief, anger, disbelief. How could she have been so quick to judge? To assume the worst based on nothing but a feeling in her gut, based on the color of his skin and the way he held his son's hand. How many times had he lived through this? How many times had he been thrust into these situations where his very existence was questioned, where the love he had for his son was turned into something dark, something dangerous? The officers, who had been so quick to act, now seemed less certain. They exchanged a brief glance, their stern faces momentarily softening as Karen's words sank in. But the damage was already done. The tension in the air, the palpable fear that had gripped the moment, hadn't dissipated. David could still feel it crawling up his spine, still hear the echoes of sirens in the distance. The trust had already been broken, both in the officers and in Karen. What do you mean, you were mistaken? One of the officers asked, his voice still laced with suspicion, but tinged with a hint of confusion. You called us here because you thought he was a threat. What's changed? Karen swallowed, her throat tight with guilt. I don't know. I saw the way he was standing, the way he was holding the boy's hand, and I thought. She hesitated, struggling to put her thoughts into words. I thought maybe something was wrong. I saw the way the boy wasn't playing with the other kids, and I thought, maybe I was kidnapping him. David finished for her, his voice colder than he intended. His words hung in the air like a slap, cutting through the moment with sharp clarity. He could feel Elijah trembling beside him, his small body still holding on to David as if the boy feared that any second, everything might spiral out of control again. Karen winced at the words, and her shoulders slumped as though the weight of her mistake had hit her full force. I wasn't thinking clearly, she said, her voice shaking now. I let my fears take over. I didn't think it through. I didn't know. David's chest tightened with a mix of fury and sadness. How many times had he been forced to live through this? How many times had he been cast into the role of the villain, the stranger, the threat? All because of fear, all because people like Karen had allowed their assumptions to override their humanity. It had happened before, and it was happening again. He wasn't just a father here, he was a black man, a black father, whose mere presence in certain spaces was enough to provoke suspicion. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the other officer stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, the officer said, his tone hard, you need to understand that making a call like that, under these circumstances, could have had serious consequences. You called us to handle a possible kidnapping, but you didn't have enough information to justify your fears." Karen's face paled, and she nodded, her eyes wide with realization. "I know," she whispered. "I know. I can't undo what I did. I'm so sorry." David's gaze shifted to the officers again. The younger officer, who had been the more skeptical of the two, was now staring at Karen with a mix of confusion and disbelief. The situation had shifted so rapidly, from a life-threatening confrontation to an uncomfortable moment of regret, and he seemed unsure of how to proceed. He glanced at David and Elijah, then back at Karen. "Look, ma'am," the officer said, his voice more measured now, "we don't usually get calls like this, and we certainly don't act on them lightly. But we have to treat every situation with the seriousness it deserves. You have to be careful when making accusations. We're not saying you meant harm, but—" "I understand," Karen interrupted, her voice low. "I understand completely. I've been selfish. I've been fearful of things I don't understand, and I let that fear cloud my judgment. It was wrong." David felt something inside him shift. He was still angry, still hurt by the assumptions that had almost torn his family apart. But there was something else there too, something that made him realize that this moment, this exchange, could be the beginning of something different. Could it be possible? Could a mistake like this actually lead to growth, to understanding? Could Karen, someone who had once seen him as a threat, actually learn from this? But as much as he wanted to believe in the possibility of change, he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. His life, his son's life, had been placed in jeopardy simply because of someone's fear, and that wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology. Not really. You don't get to erase what's happened, David said quietly, his voice low but firm. But you can learn from it. You can make sure this doesn't happen again. Karen nodded silently, her face filled with shame. "I will," she promised, her voice barely audible. "I will. I swear it." David glanced at Elijah, who was still holding his hand, still pressing close to him as if he feared another shift in the world around them. The boy's eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was also a flicker of hope, a hope that his father's calmness would bring him back to safety, that the storm was finally passing. David exhaled, his body still tense, but the immediate danger had passed. He looked at the officers, who were now silent, watching the exchange unfold. The older officer nodded slightly, his expression softening just a fraction. "We're going to clear the situation up here, sir," the officer said, his tone gentler now. "We won't hold you any longer. You and your son are free to go." David nodded, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He turned to Elijah, who was still standing at his side, his tiny hand clutching his father's tightly. The boy had no idea what had just happened, he only knew that everything had felt wrong, and now, with the officers retreating, it was beginning to feel right again. David took a deep breath, and finally, with a quiet exhale, he turned and started walking away from the scene. Elijah followed close behind, still holding his father's hand, still uncertain but trusting, as children do. As they walked away from the park, David couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this moment would be the beginning of a larger shift. Maybe there was hope, after all. But the road ahead, he knew, would still be fraught with challenges. For now, though, he focused on the one thing that mattered more than anything: he had his son, and he would always protect him. The aftermath. The walk back to the car was quiet. The usual sounds of the park, the laughter of children, the chatter of parents, had faded into the background as David and Elijah made their way toward the parking lot. The sun, which had once bathed the playground in a warm golden light, now seemed distant, its rays less comforting and more harsh as the reality of the situation sank in. David kept his eyes straight ahead, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He wanted to tell Elijah that everything was okay, that they were safe now, but the words felt hollow. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that still gnawed at him, the way the whole park had watched them, the way he had been judged before even speaking a word. And then, of course, there was Karen. Her apology had been sincere, but was it enough? Could one apology, one admission of guilt, truly undo the harm that had been done? Could it erase the moment when his world had teetered on the edge of destruction? No, David knew it couldn't. But it wasn't just the apology that bothered him, it was the fact that this would never be the last time. This was just one incident in a long, ugly pattern, a pattern that stretched back years. He had seen it before, and he would see it again, the looks, the whispers, the suspicion. Elijah walked beside him, his tiny hand still gripping David's, his steps slower now. The boy had a quiet sadness in his eyes, the kind that came from a deep, unspoken understanding. He hadn't fully grasped what had just happened, but he knew something wasn't right. He knew that the world could be a dangerous place. As they reached the car, David opened the door for Elijah and helped him into his booster seat. The boy climbed in without a word, his face still clouded with confusion, his small body folding into the seat like he was trying to disappear from the world. David fastened the seatbelt, taking a moment to look at his son, to really see him. "Elijah," David began, his voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry you had to see that. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. You didn't deserve it." The boy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply stared out of the window, watching the world go by with wide, innocent eyes. He was still processing, still trying to understand. David's heart ached for him. "I don't want to be scared anymore, Daddy," Elijah finally said, his voice small but clear. David's chest tightened. "I know, baby. I know. I don't want you to be scared either." He reached over, brushing a hand over Elijah's hair. "But sometimes, people don't understand us. And that's something we can't change. But what we can change is how we handle it. I'll always protect you, Elijah. Always." The words felt right, but even as David spoke them, he knew that protecting Elijah wasn't as simple as just offering comfort. It was about something deeper, something more painful. He would never be able to shield his son from the cruelty of the world, not entirely. But he would fight for him, every single day, to make sure that he had the strength to fight back. David closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, sliding into the seat. The engine roared to life, and for a brief moment, he just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to steady his thoughts. He didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do next. The uncertainty loomed like a shadow, stretching out over everything. "Can we go home, Daddy?" Elijah asked, breaking the silence. His voice was still uncertain, but it held a quiet plea for normalcy, for the world to return to what it had been before. David nodded, putting the car in gear. "Yeah, buddy. We're going home." He drove out of the parking lot, not looking back at the park, not even glancing at the houses they passed. He just focused on the road ahead, trying to block out the haunting memory of the police, of Karen, of everything that had just happened. The only thing that mattered now was getting Elijah home. Safe. The drive was long, but it gave David time to think, time to process everything. He couldn't help but feel like he was caught in an endless cycle. For as long as he could remember, he had always been the other. The man who stood out, the man who was too loud, too dark, too different. But none of that mattered when it came to his son. Elijah was his world. And as much as David tried to shield him from the pain, from the prejudice, from the uncertainty of their lives, he knew that one day, Elijah would have to face it too. And that thought hit him harder than anything else. The world had changed so much in the years since David had been Elijah's age, but some things never changed. The fear, the judgment, the way people saw him as a threat instead of a person. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make that change. Maybe it wouldn't happen overnight, but maybe if people like Karen could recognize their own biases, maybe if they could acknowledge their mistakes, the world would start to shift. It had to. As they pulled into the driveway, David glanced over at Elijah, who was now staring out of the window again, his eyes far away. David turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle between them. He wanted to believe that things would get better. He had to. For Elijah. They got out of the car and walked into the house. David made sure Elijah was settled on the couch with a snack, his small hands wrapped around a cookie as he gazed at the TV. It wasn't much, but it was a moment of peace. A moment of normalcy. David stood in the doorway of the living room, watching his son, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to take a breath. Things were far from perfect, but at least they were safe. For now. But deep down, David knew that this was just the beginning. The battle for understanding, for equality, for justice, this was a fight that would never end. And though he would never stop fighting for Elijah, he would also never stop fighting for a world where his son wouldn't have to grow up in fear. David couldn't change everything in one day, but he could start with himself. He could start with Elijah. And that, at least, was enough.